It was a sunny afternoon in a small city, the kind of day where the warmth in the air seemed to complement the peaceful energy of the neighborhood. The streets were lined with modest homes, each with neatly trimmed lawns and children playing outside, their laughter ringing faintly in the background. Among the residents was a black woman, a figure of quiet strength and confidence. She was either driving her familiar route or walking the streets she had known for years, carrying herself with the assurance of someone who belonged. Her neighborhood was her sanctuary, a place where she felt at ease, shielded from the noise and tension of the larger world. This was where she had built her life, earned the respect of her community, and found a sense of peace that was often elusive in other spaces. She had always been aware of the subtle, and sometimes overt, challenges that came with being a black woman, navigating societal biases, but here, in her neighborhood, she allowed herself to relax. However, the tranquility of her day took a sharp turn when a police cruiser, a vehicle synonymous with authority and tension in many neighborhoods like hers, appeared. Behind the wheel sat a white police officer, his presence casting a shadow over the sunny day. He drove slowly, his eyes fixed on her, his demeanor radiating suspicion. He wasn't just passing through or minding his patrol route. He was watching her. At first, she noticed the car in her periphery and dismissed it as routine. But as the seconds ticked by, it became apparent that this wasn't coincidental. The officer continued to follow, his pace matching hers, his focus unwavering. Her instincts told her what was coming, a scenario all too familiar in a society where prejudice often seeped into the cracks of power. The woman maintained her composure, her mind already calculating her next moves. She had done nothing wrong. She didn't speed, jaywalk, or otherwise disrupt the harmony of her surroundings. And yet, the officer's gaze bore into her like a silent accusation. It wasn't about her actions. It was about who she was, what she represented to him. To him, her existence in that moment warranted scrutiny. The police cruiser came to a halt, and the officer stepped out. His movements were deliberate, his hand resting on his utility belt, where a host of tools symbolizing power hung ominously. He approached her, his expression a mix of authority and skepticism, as if he were already convinced that she had committed some offense. "Ma'am," he began, his tone sharp and demanding, "what are you doing here?" The question itself carried an edge, implying that her presence in her own neighborhood was somehow questionable. She looked at him steadily, her calm demeanor contrasting sharply with his aggressive posture. Her voice, when she replied, was steady and polite, but firm. "I live here." "Is there a problem, officer?" Her words were met with an incredulous smirk, as if he couldn't quite believe her assertion. "Do you have ID on you?" he pressed, his request less about procedure and more about asserting dominance. His eyes scanned her, searching for any sign that might confirm his biases. Around them, the neighborhood's usual hum had quieted. A few residents watched from their porches or through curtains, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. The scene unfolding was all too familiar, an unnecessary confrontation predicated on assumptions rather than evidence. The woman, aware of the growing audience and the potential for escalation, reached into her bag deliberately, pulling out her ID. "Here," she said, handing it to him with a measured calm. "This is my name, my address, and yes, I live here." He examined the ID, his frown deepening. His sense of control over the situation wavered, but his bias wouldn't let him concede. "What brings you out here today?" he asked, his tone accusatory, as though her explanation of living there wasn't enough to satisfy him. Her patience was tested, but her resolve was stronger. "Officer, I'm walking through my own neighborhood, on my own street. Unless you can tell me what law I've broken, I'd like to carry on with my day." Her assertiveness didn't sit well with him. To him, her calm refusal to cower was defiance, and defiance was unacceptable. His hand hovered near his radio, his posture stiffening, as if preparing to escalate the situation further. But she remained unmoved, her composure a stark contrast to his growing aggression. The tension between them grew thick, the air charged with unspoken conflict. In that moment, she wasn't just defending her right to walk through her own neighborhood. She was standing up against a lifetime of microaggressions, assumptions, and systemic bias. The confrontation, though brief, set the stage for a larger reckoning. It wasn't just about the momentary clash between a biased officer and a resilient woman. It was about two worlds colliding. Her steadfast dignity hinted at the change that was about to come, and his overreach would soon be met with consequences far beyond what he could have anticipated. She was more than the officer assumed, a lot more. Her background was nothing short of remarkable, shaped by years of relentless dedication to justice and fairness. A seasoned law enforcement professional with accolades and experience that outshone many in her field, she had spent over a decade climbing the ranks, often as the only black woman in spaces dominated by white men. Her career was a testament to resilience. She believed deeply in the ideals of justice and equality, not as abstract principles, but as achievable goals. Her path to law enforcement was born from a personal mission. Growing up in a neighborhood where trust in the police was thin and fear thick, she had vowed to be a part of the change. She didn't just want to enforce the law, she wanted to transform how it was enforced. Over time, her work spoke volumes. She implemented community engagement programs, mentored younger officers, and spearheaded initiatives aimed at bridging gaps between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Despite these efforts, systemic barriers often dimmed her achievements, reducing her voice to a whisper in a room full of shouts. Still, she persevered. She was acutely aware of the resistance she faced, not just from the outside world, but within her own profession. Her innovative ideas were dismissed as idealistic. Her critiques of bias were brushed aside as overreactions, and her steadfast pursuit of accountability often earned her the label of being difficult. Yet she stood firm, knowing that every step forward was a small but meaningful shift in the right direction. In stark contrast stood the white officer who had confronted her. His career painted a very different picture. While she climbed the ranks with integrity and tireless effort, he had coasted on the currents of privilege and entitlement. Years in the department had only reinforced his biases, his sense of invincibility growing unchecked by meaningful oversight. To his colleagues, he was a polarizing figure, praised by some for his tough approach, but quietly criticized by others for his apparent disregard for ethics. His record was speckled with complaints, excessive stops of minorities, aggressive behavior during routine interactions, and a pattern of escalating situations unnecessarily. Yet none of these complaints ever stuck. They were brushed aside with excuses or buried under the shield of department policy. He wore his badge as a symbol of power rather than responsibility, a distinction that informed every interaction he had. To him, the law wasn't a tool for equity. It was a means to assert control. The incident with her was no different, just another instance in a long line of actions fueled by bias and emboldened by a system that rarely held him accountable. Their encounter, however, was unlike anything he had experienced. Unbeknownst to him, the woman he sought to intimidate wasn't just a victim of his prejudice. She was a force he was wholly unprepared for, a catalyst who would bring to light everything he had tried to keep in the shadows. Her story and his behavior were about to collide, setting the stage for a reckoning far beyond his imagination. The officer approached with the air of someone who had made up his mind long before he spoke. His hand rested on his utility belt as he demanded identification, his tone sharp and dismissive. "What are you doing here?" he barked, eyeing the black woman with a mixture of suspicion and condescension. "This doesn't look like your kind of neighborhood." The woman, poised and calm, reached for her ID with deliberate care. "I'm on my way home," she replied, her voice even but firm. "Is there a specific reason you stopped me, officer?" He ignored her question, doubling down instead. "We've had reports of suspicious activity around here," he said, though his words lacked conviction. "You fit the description." She glanced at the growing crowd of passers-by who had begun to slow down, sensing the tension. Some discreetly pulled out their phones, recording the scene. The woman kept her composure, meeting his gaze directly. "What description would that be?" she asked, her tone tinged with quiet defiance. The officer's irritation grew. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, leaning in slightly as if to assert dominance. "I'm asking the questions here." What followed was a back and forth that highlighted the officer's blatant disregard for protocol and respect. Despite her calm explanations, he escalated the situation, his words laced with veiled threats. "If you don't want this to get worse, you'd better cooperate," he warned, raising his voice. The tension thickened as the crowd grew, murmurs of discomfort rippling through the onlookers. "She hasn't done anything," someone called out from the sidelines, their voice barely audible over the officer's rant. The woman, still composed, refused to let the officer's hostility dictate her response. It wasn't until he stepped closer, his posture aggressive, that she decided it was time to shift the narrative. She straightened her shoulders, her voice steady but louder now, carrying an unmistakable authority. "Officer," she began, "do you know who I am?" He scoffed, brushing off her words. "I don't care who you are. If you're in the wrong, you'll be treated like anyone else." Her next words froze him in his tracks. "I am the newly appointed chief of police for this city," she announced, her voice slicing through the murmurs of the crowd. She reached into her bag, producing her badge and holding it up for all to see. "And I outrank you." The silence that followed was deafening. The officer's face drained of color as he stared at the badge, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of his misjudgment. The crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs, phones now held even higher to capture every moment of the unfolding drama. The woman took a step forward, her eyes locked on his. "You've not only disrespected me," she said, her tone firm but controlled, "but you've disrespected the principles of justice and fairness that this badge stands for. Your behavior is unacceptable, and it will not go unchecked." The officer stammered, trying to find his footing, but the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The crowd began to cheer, their voices growing louder in support of the woman who had turned a moment of indignity into a defining act of authority. She turned to the onlookers, nodding briefly before addressing the officer one last time. "We'll be discussing your conduct in my office tomorrow," she said sharply. As she walked away, the crowd parted for her like a tide, their admiration clear in their expressions. The officer stood frozen, the weight of his actions crashing down as the reality of who he had just confronted settled in. The officer's demeanor shifted immediately after her revelation. His once confident stance faltered, and a look of panic flashed across his face. Stammering, he began to backtrack, his voice now devoid of the arrogance it had carried moments earlier. "Chief, I didn't realize," he muttered, his words stumbling over themselves as he tried to justify his behavior. "I was just doing my job." The woman, unshaken by his sudden change in tone, stood firm. Her expression was a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "Your job," she said sharply, "is to serve and protect, not to harass and intimidate." Her voice carried a quiet authority that silenced the murmurs of the crowd, commanding their attention as effectively as it had unraveled the officer's confidence. Turning to a nearby bystander who still had their phone raised, she asked, "Are you recording this?" The individual nodded, a hint of nervousness in their expression. "Good," she said, her gaze cutting back to the officer, "because accountability begins with visibility." Without missing a beat, she ordered the officer to stand down. "Return to your patrol car," she instructed, her voice crisp. "You will be contacted shortly regarding the investigation into your conduct. Effective immediately, you're relieved of duty until further notice." The officer hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond, but the gathering crowd made compliance his only option. His shoulders slumped as he turned and walked back to his car, the weight of his actions dragging with every step. The woman, now alone in the spotlight, turned to face the onlookers. In the age of social media, moments like these rarely stayed confined to their original audience. Within hours, videos of the confrontation flooded platforms, igniting a firestorm of reactions. News outlets picked up the story, headlines proclaiming, "New police chief confronts racism in her own department." The incident became a rallying point for the community, and a stark example of the systemic issues she had long sought to address. The reaction was swift and powerful. The community, already aware of her appointment, rallied behind her with fervent support. Residents praised her composure and courage in facing the very biases she had been tasked to eliminate. Social media platforms buzzed with messages of solidarity, and prominent voices in civil rights and justice reform amplified her story, calling it a defining moment in the fight against racial profiling. Many saw the incident as a stark reflection of the challenges she had been warning about, and a reminder of how deep-rooted prejudice could manifest, even within institutions designed to uphold justice. But for others, it was a symbol of hope, a moment that proved change was not only possible, but already in motion. By the end of the day, the woman's actions had not only solidified her standing as a leader, but also ignited a broader conversation about the systemic changes needed in law enforcement. She had turned an act of injustice into a catalyst for transformation, her resolve setting the tone for what would come next. The formal investigation into the officer's behavior moved swiftly, leaving no stone unturned. Witness testimonies, videos from bystanders, and the officer's record of prior complaints painted a damning picture of his conduct. It became clear that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of misuse of authority. Within days, the department announced his suspension, and not long after, he was terminated. Facing legal and professional consequences, the officer's career unraveled as he became a cautionary example of the department's zero-tolerance policy under its new leadership. The police chief wasted no time addressing the underlying issues that the incident had exposed. At a press conference, she stood before a sea of reporters and community members, her composure and conviction unshakable. "This incident is not just about one officer's actions," she began. "It's about a culture that has, for too long, allowed bias and misconduct to go unchecked. That changes now. True to her word, she announced a comprehensive reform plan. Mandatory training on implicit bias and cultural competency would be rolled out for all officers. New accountability measures, including body cameras and independent reviews of misconduct allegations, were introduced. She emphasized that every officer in her department would be held to the highest standards, with no exceptions. The community's response was overwhelmingly positive. Residents, who had long distrusted law enforcement, began to feel a sense of hope. Community leaders praised her swift actions and her willingness to collaborate with local organizations to build bridges. Meetings were held to open dialogue between officers and the neighborhoods they served, fostering understanding and mutual respect. Under her leadership, the department underwent a transformation. The police force, once a symbol of division, began to be seen as a partner in community well-being. Officers who shared her vision of equity and justice stepped up, supporting her reforms and actively working to regain the community's trust. The police chief's efforts didn't stop at departmental changes. She partnered with schools, community centers, and advocacy groups to address the root causes of conflict. From youth outreach programs to workshops on de-escalation and conflict resolution, her commitment to empowerment extended beyond law enforcement, creating opportunities for marginalized voices to be heard and uplifted. The impact of her leadership resonated far beyond her city. Law enforcement agencies in neighboring areas took note, and some even adopted similar reforms inspired by her work. She became a national figure in police reform, her name synonymous with accountability, justice, and change. Through her actions, she turned a moment of humiliation into a movement for empowerment, ensuring that her community would no longer tolerate prejudice or injustice. Her resilience and vision set a powerful example, proving that even in the face of adversity, change is always possible when guided by determination and integrity. The police department, once criticized for its lack of accountability, began to transform under her leadership. The changes were immediate and impactful. Officers were required to attend training sessions on implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and community engagement. A new internal oversight committee was established to investigate complaints, ensuring transparency and fairness. Morale within the department began to shift as officers who valued integrity embraced the changes, and those resistant to accountability were compelled to adapt or leave. Community engagement became a cornerstone of her leadership. Town hall meetings were held regularly, giving residents a platform to voice concerns and provide feedback directly to the department. Programs were implemented to bridge the gap between officers and citizens, such as mentoring initiatives for local youth and joint neighborhood improvement projects. The department's presence in the community evolved from one of enforcement to partnership, fostering a sense of trust that had long been missing. The incident that sparked her rise to leadership became a national story, highlighting the systemic issues within policing. Advocacy groups, local leaders, and national figures praised her swift actions and commitment to reform. Her department's transformation became a model for others, inspiring similar changes in neighboring cities. Discussions about equity and justice in policing gained momentum, with her story serving as a powerful example of what could be achieved when leadership aligned with values of fairness and accountability. Despite the challenges she faced, the new police chief remained focused on her mission. She approached each day with a blend of determination and humility, understanding that meaningful change required persistence and collaboration. Her ability to balance strength and empathy earned her respect not only from her officers, but also from the community she served. In the final scene, the woman sits in her office, a space that symbolizes both the weight of her responsibility and the potential for progress. Through the window, she observes the city she has sworn to protect, its streets bustling with life and hope. On her desk lies a copy of the department's new mission statement, a reflection of her vision for a just and equitable police force. Her thoughts briefly return to the day of the incident, a moment that could have broken her spirit, but instead became the catalyst for change. She knows the work ahead is far from over, but she's ready to face it with unwavering resolve. As she prepares for the day, her words echo with conviction. Justice isn't about power. It's about doing what's right, no matter who you are. The story closes with her walking out of the office to meet her team, a symbol of leadership grounded in integrity, and a reminder that one person's courage can ignite a movement for justice and equality.